We're talking today with George Stoney, who is a professor at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University and is the maker of over 50 documentary videos and films spanning over 50 years. Is that correct, George? Yeah. Just as importantly for many of us who work within community access television, George has been at the leading edge of development of community television in the United States over the course of almost 40 years. And he joins us here to talk about access television, community television, and working with community media. George Stoney, welcome to SPNN.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I've often admired the work that comes out of this place.
Well, and you were here in the Twin Cities almost at the birth of community access television. Is that correct?
I think I was there. That's right.
Now, I want to get to that a little bit later in our discussion, but I guess one of the chief questions I have for you as a filmmaker, why are you interested in community television?
Well, you see, I don't think of myself primarily as a filmmaker. I was a journalist, and when I started making films, I was involved as a writer. And then it was film. So you learned to do the other crafts. But I realized very early that I was making films for people who should be making them themselves, you know, teachers and doctors and agricultural specialists and so forth. They knew more than I did, but they had to go through that
intermediary.
And intermediaries always change. Good example is the letter writer. I used to use that as a metaphor, and then I went to Ghana, and I actually saw the letter writers, people with typewriters around the post office typing letters for people. And through a translator, I went up, and the guy was saying, I want to write my mother, so and so and so and so. No, you shouldn't say it that way. You should say it this way.
Well, so it's it's more than just a letter writer. It's somebody who's also impressing their own views and opinions on the content.
And I realized that if it was some way that people could do it to themselves, they would have more responsibility to the viewer, and they would also convey their own feelings more. And I was constantly having to work with sponsors, and the sponsors would have one idea. I'd take the idea to the field and find out it wasn't resonating with the people in the field. And then I'd have to go back to the sponsors, so the sponsor would have that experience himself or herself if they had to confront the situation in the field. And so at that time, film was so clumsy, so expensive, that they needed intermediaries. Now look, we have the user-friendly equipment. People who could use computers could edit fairly simply. What do they need us for?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I actually hear that from the other side. I mean, you're a proponent of community media. You're a proponent of people working with communities to help them express themselves. I've also heard on the other side where I guess I'd call them sort of technological determinists who talk about, you know, cheap technology, relatively available. Why exactly would you want to have, you know, a nonprofit organization supporting that work when people can just do it themselves now?
They need to get together. They need to work in communities to produce the media. And if they're working in isolation, they're not answering those questions about how is it affecting people. And it can become a personal medium. But true community media is a collective. It's the person who receives it as well as the person who is making it. And that's why I keep saying that our access centers should be places where people work together.
As opposed to just places where individuals get up on a platform.
That's right.
I want to talk about how we got to that place a little bit later
Okay.
on in the conversation. Let me turn specifically to this question of, seeing yourself as an intermediary and turning over the megaphone of media to the subjects.
Yeah.
Was there a particular project that you were doing where that became very, very apparent to you? Where the light bulb came on and
I kept stumbling on it.
Okay.
I think it was I was doing a lot of films for doctors. I worked for several years through the Association of American Medical Colleges. They had an audiovisual branch. And I was constantly having to work with the doctors and their patients. And that was when I began to feel this most acutely. Very often the doctors were isolated from what was happening in the hospitals to their own patients. They didn't realize the tension that was between the nurses and the doctors. I was stumbling into this because I had to get into that hospital room. I had to court the nurse to enable me to get to the material I needed. And I suppose that was part of it. It kept coming up there. And so I realized that while I could get more work done if I could just get rid of the guy. I realized if I did that, I wasn't doing my job because he should have been involved, you see. And then I could learn from him what to put in the film.
So really, it starts a process of having the subjects that you're dealing with create the content.
That's right.
For the delivery to an audience.
Now, you see, that was difficult because I was working on a contract. Contract means time, precision, and so forth and so on. So it was easier for me to just get the contract, do the work,
right.
Keep the sponsor happy.
Right, and treat it as an industrial process
right,
where
yes.
you're knocking out, you're making sausages,
That's right,
or
yeah.
you're knocking out widgets, basically.
But at the same time, I had to realize over and over and over again that I was making documentaries. The people in front of the camera were collaborating. And I couldn't just use them as pure subject matter. And that was a profound revelation.
Now, did that inform some of the work that you were doing in Canada with?
I'd been doing it beforehand. I think
right.
that was why they asked me to come up to take over the program for a couple of years. Why the dickens should they get an American to come to Canada?
Right. So this is in the 1960s.
The late 60s, yes.
And it's a community development exercise that the
right.
Canadian government was involved with to be using media to help spark community development in communities of need.
It was the 60s when we thought, if we could just communicate. All the world would
That'll
be
solve all the problems. Yes, okay.
If we could just communicate.
Yeah.
And so the Canadian government wanted to see if they could create some kind of dialogue between the government agencies and the people they served.
Seems like a naive, interesting idea.
Yeah. And the film board was an ideal catalyst for that. And so that was the basis of the program. For example, we made a film called Wilf. It was done by Bob Nichols, who was a wonderful cameraman. And because he had demonstrated his skill as a cameraman, he got the right to make a personal film. And he made a lovely film about this old farmer. But he needed some extra money, and I had a budget within the bureaucracy. And so he came and showed it to me, and I thought, how could we use this as a way of helping the government in its program? Well, the Canadian government at the time realized that there were about 300,000 farmers, farm families, living on Canadian Shield land where they weren't making a decent living. And it was costing the government so much money to service those people, with welfare and schools and so forth and so on. They wanted to move them off. That was a decision made at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Then, but the level under that, people were getting, how many acres have you cleared? And how many families have you moved? Not which and what. The old quantification by numbers,
mm-hmm.
which is a curse of the whole generation now. And so that the wrong people were being moved. Well, this old farmer had a set life. And so what we did was, and he shouldn't be moved, and yet he was an ideal person to persuade to move. So what we did was to show the film to the committee and have them talk about this, and we used their dialogue over the thing. So you experienced the debate, but you saw a real live person on the screen.
So you're actually seeing the real effects of the abstract
and it
discussion.
Worked.
Now, has that thread of using media for community development remained active here in the United States?
Well, it has to some extent in Canada. They just called me up the other day and wanted me to come up because they're going to make a film about Challenge for Change. Okay. And Jack Bensiman, who is the commissioner for the film board, has revived Challenge for Change in some ways, and they've just made one of the first items on it was something called Cod Help Us.
About the Maritimes and,
yes,
and
that's right.
the cod fishing
so
industry.
The idea is there. Well, I was there for only 2 years, and I was really proud of what we were doing. So when I came back to the States, we set up the Alternate Media Center in good part to try to see if we could continue it. Well, I did a number of experiments, and it never worked.
Well, why was that?
Well, the first place, in Canada, you conciliate before you confront. Mm-hmm. In this country, that's considered weakness. Mm-hmm. You confront and then you conciliate. And
so that process of dialogue
that's right.
isn't necessarily within political processes that we have here.
It's just instinctively almost.
Yeah.
And also, the people, as I said, confront first, but the film board was the intermediary, a trusted intermediary. And I have never found an intermediary that both sides could accept as readily as they could the film board. So I think for that to work, both sides have to want to dialogue, and you have to have a trusted intermediary.
Some type of neutral institution
that
has a degree of a degree of legitimacy.
That's right.
Right. Uh-huh. Some stability, I would imagine, so it's not going to go away next year, so people can ignore it.
Yeah.
And that's never really been the case with many of these media centers within the United States.
And of course, the way we tend to judge everything by the bottom line, how many, how much, mm-hmm. and on an annual basis, mm-hmm. so that we have so little social continuity.
Mm-hmm. The Alternative Media Center got started in New York in the early 70s.
72, yes.
And one of the things I think that is interesting for me as I look at it is that it's an early experiment of an access center, but the descriptions I've read about it doesn't sound like an access television center as many people understand them in U.S. communities now. I mean, Can you talk a little bit about
Well,
the difference of vision then as opposed to the vision people may have now?
As you know, we can all look back and make patterns out of our lives,
Right.
which we never conceived in the first place.
Correct. I mean, if we knew that we were going to be here today, would we really have started the journey? But anyway,
That's
yeah,
right.
right.
So that Red Burns and I started it because we wanted to do something like Challenge for Change.
Right.
But as so often happens, the money determines what you do. And the Markle Foundation gave us money to experiment in cable television because they saw it as a big new thing. And so, whoops.
And whoops, there goes the legacy, actually. And I think it's really quite interesting because then community media centers become inextricably linked with cable as a funding mechanism.
That's right.
Here in the United States for the next 35 years.
Good point. Exactly.
For good and evil.
Yes. Yes.
On the upside, there's a great deal of stability there because of the relative stability of the funding mechanism within cable monopolies.
Yeah.
The downside is the relative dependence that breeds.
Exactly.
And many centers actually don't see themselves as a part of the community necessarily. At least, I mean, I'm editorializing a little bit here. I'd kind of like to hear a little bit of your own opinions about this.
Well, I'm probably too much influenced by my experience of being on the board of the Manhattan Neighborhood Network for the last several years and seeing our problems and our challenges. Though I do travel and I've seen a lot of access centers around the country. And I'm loath to generalize because each one has it's shaped itself by the nature of the community, the nature of the people who take over the access center, and the understanding of the city fathers who allow it.
So you have a mixture of political culture plus artistic culture.
You see, I wish it were more like the public library. I wish it were just generally understood that we should have access centers in the same way that it's generally understood that you can convince even people who never read that yes, you should have a library. The library is a good thing.
But that's a long-term vision, George,
yes,
isn't it?
Right.
I mean, I guess we could go back in the time machine to the 1860s, just following the Civil War.
Yes.
The idea of a public library really would have been an alien institution, right?
That's right. Most of the libraries were private.
Right. Most of the libraries were private.
Yes.
Knowledge is something that is really owned by individuals. Books are precious objects. So the entire idea of public investment in knowledge and in institutions that transfer knowledge is sort of one of the revolutions of the late 19th century with this sort of reinvention of America.
But it's interesting that speaking of quantification, how the libraries have reached a point where they're given actually a dollar value. A library is good for the community, and it's good for real estate. The Port Washington Public Library, marvelous thing. I've often been out there. But the real estate people are all around bragging about that.
Because it's a public amenity.
Exactly.
It's something that has both a metaphorical value as well as a financial value.
That's right.
So it's interesting how that works. I suppose that parkland is like that as well. It's not necessarily productive land, quote unquote. Yeah. You can't necessarily build a house on it and sell it to somebody else, but it derives some other value to the rest of the community.
But let's see what the professionals in the library have added, which I think we can learn from as you and I, in effect, as professionals in community media. The librarians have kind of an understanding that they stand for free speech. They stand for open access. They stand for a variety of tastes, and they are not too much influenced by the immediate popularity.
Well, in terms of the book choices,
Yes,
for
that's
example, the diversity of information.
They'll get 8 or 9 copies of certain bestsellers.
Right.
But they know that they're going to get the obscure poets. They have the standard books. They don't put Wordsworth. They don't put him on remainder because nobody's checked out a Wordsworth poem for the last 2 years.
And further, I don't go to the library only for the books that I want to read necessarily. I don't support the library because of the 20 books I want to read in the coming year, and I only want those 20 books to be bought and purchased and supported by the library.
But the library profession has set up certain standards. For example, when on censorship, and it happens every year or so, some community says that yells that we shouldn't have Uncle Tom's Cabin or couldn't have
Huckleberry Finn,
Huckleberry Finn, and so forth and so on, and the local governing body says yes, take it out. Well, they simply put it on the internet and put it on the news, and everybody says, yeah, you're behind the times, you're an ignorant community, and they withdraw. It happens yearly. The librarians have set up a certain professional standard, and I hope we can do the same eventually.
Well, doesn't that mean that there needs some type of institutional investment in building knowledge within the field?
Exactly, that's right.
What does that mean in terms of just long-term commitment?
Well, we're beginning now to have some training in universities. The program at UMass Boston, for example, in public, it's community
technology and,
yes, that's right.
and media, I believe.
Yeah. And Fred Johnson's there now, and Jim Green. And I think they're doing some good training. And I think in a number of other places we're beginning to get that kind of thought involved. But it's the understanding of that when people work together on producing media, something is happening within that group, which is more than just what you see on the screen. And so it's very little media training prepares you to take on that responsibility.
I mean,
maybe it can, but I'm not sure.
To be more concrete about that, I mean, you could be taught how to focus a lens or turn on a microphone or push a button.
Yeah.
But to, be involved with a group of people as they're trying to work out their problems isn't something that you learn in a technical training course in television or radio.
And students learn to cut very fast and follow the fancy things. But to get them to use their materials and feel what it does to an audience and see what it does to the people involved is a very difficult process.
Well, it seems to me that it's being made more difficult because of the fractioning of audience and the fragmentation of audience that so many people have talked about with so many different types of media and so many different types of what I call mediated experience, right? Where we define our experiences in terms of the sort of smaller and fractioned audiences and subcultures that exist within the modern media landscape. I would imagine that generalizing about those experiences of audiences is becoming harder and harder to do.
Well, I start, and I'm still teaching production courses at NYU. I start with the person in front of the camera and the person who's involved with this situation. What is this doing for them? How do they feel? How are they changed by being involved? And then you move from there to how can they use it with the people around them? And get away from the measure, did it make a festival? Mm-hmm. Did it win a prize? Mm-hmm. Does it look slick? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a difficult balance.
Well, I think the other